Welcome back to the last segment of the Sustainability Summit. We are talking agriculture in partnership with Syngenta. The following panel discussion is about sustainable food markets and trade. This will be facilitated by Mr. Andrianos Gianu, who is the Public Affairs Manager from Euractiv. And I look forward to hearing more about what Euractiv is about. And of course, the facilitator will then be responsible for welcoming and introducing our panelists for the last segment. Please don't forget to hashtag SAS Summit 2020. That is hashtag SAS Summit 2020. We look forward to receiving your views, your comments, your questions, and recommendations. Thank you very much and enjoy the session. Over to you, Mr. Giano.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second panel of the Achieving a Sustainable Reset in Agriculture session. My name is Andrianos Gianu, and I'm the Public Affairs Manager at Euractiv. Euractiv is an independent pan-European media network specialized in EU policies. I'm joining you today from my newsroom in the heart of the European Quarter in Brussels. I will be your moderator for this panel, and we're going to be looking at sustainable food markets and trade. Thank you very much for joining us today. I would also like to thank Syngenta for making this panel possible. I would like to do some housekeeping first. I will start the session by introducing our esteemed panelists, and then I will ask them for an introductory statement of 10 minutes on our session's topic. Then I will follow up with a round of questions before taking questions from the audience. Please make sure to submit your questions through the chat function that's on the right-hand side of your screen. We will end the panel with short concluding remarks from our speakers. If you're posting about this on social media, which we encourage you to do, please use the hashtag SUSSummit2020. That's hashtag SUS Summit 2020. We're living in a world of increasing food demand fueled by a growing population. The global population is projected to increase to nearly 8 billion by 2030 and more than 9 billion by 2050. This is being coupled with increasing urbanization and a growing middle class, creating a demand for high quality food. Meanwhile, food insecurity is on the rise. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations have classified the current time as a new era of rising food prices and spreading hunger, noting that, and I quote, "Food supplies are tightening everywhere and land is becoming the most sought after commodity as the world shifts from an age of food abundance to one of scarcity." As we heard from our first panel today, despite being dependent on food imports, Africa contains most of the world's arable land. So how can farmers get better access to global markets? How can we ensure sustainability is streamlined into the way that our markets function without creating any barriers that our farmers cannot meet? What role does international trade play in helping feed the world's growing population? These are some of the questions that our panelists will be answering today. Our first speaker is Anthony Delport. He's the head of South Africa for Syngenta. He holds an honor's degree in agronomy from the University of the Free State in South Africa. He was appointed as the national sales manager for Syngenta Agro Chemicals in 2000, and later as the national business manager for Syngenta South Africa soon after the company was formed. He became the country head of the South Africa operations for Syngenta in 2004. Mr. Delport, I'll start with you. How can trades and markets help deliver sustainable development? And what is the role of international trade? And how can we improve farmers' access to markets? Please, thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Adrianos. International trade and markets play a critical role in helping unlock a country's potential. As South Africans, we know this with first-hand experience. The liberalization of our domestic and external markets enable us to grow exponentially. Studies show that trade liberalization led to an approximately 50% increase on GDP per capita. From 1980 till 2003, thanks to market liberalization, we also became an engine of growth in the continent. During that period, South Africa accounted for not less than 30% of the expansion in Africa GDP. And our growth helped other countries to also increase their GDP as well. That meant more jobs, more secure income for the population, and a better lifestyle. Agriculture as an industry is particularly important. It is not only crucial in providing food security, it's the main source of jobs and livelihoods in our continent. We are living in a continent that still houses more than half of the world population facing food insecurity, despite its potential to be able to feed the world's growing population. So how do we unlock the potential of our continent to produce the necessary quantity and quality of food? And how do we use markets to enable that? Well, firstly, it's important we do that sustainably, which a number of speakers already mentioned this morning. The United Nations Agenda for Sustainable Development recognizes international trade as an engine for inclusive economic growth and poverty reduction, and an important means to achieve the global sustainable development goals. As a globally leading agricultural company, we are committed to and are contributing towards the achievement of the sustainable development goals with pride. What our experience shows is that our industry work in providing cutting-edge innovation and economic support needs to be coupled with a necessary regulatory environment. Next year, the African Union and the European Union are due to agree on their strategic partnership areas. The EU is currently proposing that green transition and agriculture form part of that partnership. It is important that the strategy and partnership areas are adapted to the reality on our continent. We need an African green transition that takes into account the ongoing yield gap and the lower use of modern innovative practices and instruments in Africa compared to Europe. We need an African green transition that enables Africa to make the most of technology and innovation, but in a sustainable way and in partnership with the different parts of society, including the private sector. Africa's main trading partner is the European Union. Trade with the EU accounts for 31% of Africa's exports and 29% of its imports. As a regional bloc, the EU is also South Africa's largest trade partner in the world. And South Africa is the EU's biggest trade partner in Africa. When the EU questions the necessity of certain products used in farming, this impacts agriculture around the world. This is despite the varied weather conditions and pest pressures that may be faced. For example, in South Africa, the highly infectious fall armyworm may require us to use products that would not be necessary in Europe, because Europe does not have a fall armyworm infestation. We hope to remain in dialogue with our European partners so that regulation impacting both sides of the continent are fit for purpose. In order to maximize its potential for free trade agreements, it's important that standards used are accepted by all parties and that tariff and non-tariff barriers are minimized and removed where possible. We support adoption of global reference standards where they are available. For example, those prepared by scientists, experts, and governments through the WHO and FAO Codex Alimentarius Commission. We'd like to see Codex, the International Food Code, outlining codes, guidelines, and codes of practice, have more resources and better global adoption of the scientific risk assessed in terms of the situation. This would support the free trade agreements and fair trade in safe food around the world. Trade plays a crucial role for the economy of Africa, and indeed, if we get it right, it can help unlock our continent's potential sustainably. In many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, foreign trade measured in terms of imports and exports of goods and services represents more than 50% of GDP. For South Africa, this figure is even higher. International trade represents almost 60% of our country's GDP. We also need to work on reducing cost of export, and this is quite important. This will hugely benefit local farmers and businesses. Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest cost to export compared with all other regions, and the highest cost to import, with the exception of Latin America and the Caribbean based on border compliance, and South Asia based on documentary compliance. Let me move on to trade within Africa. Currently, if your goods has to cross more than one border in Africa, it almost becomes unprofitable. Africa can do much more business within the continent if tariffs, red tape, and regulatory barriers are removed. There's clear room for improvement for trade among African countries. Intra-African trade in terms of exports and imports was around 2% during the 15-17, while comparative figures for America, Asia, and Europe were respectively 47, 61, and 67%. The African Continental Free Trade Area has a lot of potential as the world's largest free trade area. Committing member countries to removing tariffs on 90% of goods, progressively liberalize trade in services, and address the host of other non-tariff barriers. Once fully implemented, hopefully in January 21, as foreseen, the African Continental Free Trade Area is expected to cover all 55 African countries, with a combined GDP of over $3 trillion USD. Based on our own experience, we are always happy to provide insights on some of the bottlenecks to business growth that Africa could really benefit from addressing. Having the market opportunities to buy and sell as freely as possible, nationally, regionally, and internationally, will be a game changer. Removing trade barriers through initiatives like the African Common Free Trade Area, governments will unleash the potential of growers and the value chain across the continent. Having common standards and rules will also make it easier to trade, but improvements are needed in the implementation of those rules to allow trade improvements to deliver results. Let's harmonize risk-based standards, registration, and licensing system across Africa in a simple, flexible, transparent, business-friendly, and predictable manner. Let me give a current example of a key challenge that the industry faces. There are different shelf lives set for our products in different countries in Africa. These vary from 6 months to 2 years. Combine that with the amount of time it currently takes to get our products through customs and into the countries in some areas, it's becoming almost unprofitable for us to supply the product due to the barriers in place. The inconsistency in applying these also becomes a problem, as it can take from a couple of weeks to a couple of months to get product from the south to the east of Africa. Yet our product is needed to support livelihoods and food security. Syngenta is one of the world's leading agricultural innovation companies with roots going back more than 250 years. Its 48,000 people across more than 100 countries strive to transform agriculture to breakthrough products and technologies that play a vital role in enabling the food chain to feed the world safely, but also sustainably and with respect for our planet. With the work we are supporting a transition towards more sustainable food markets. We are integrating sustainability into agriculture at all stages, from the products that we develop to the farming practices that we promote. For example, let me focus on how we are helping fight climate change and helping reduce agriculture's carbon footprint in global markets. The Earth's soil and maintaining its capacity to store carbon is a key part of the global aim to tackle climate change and reach the Global Paris Agreement goals on climate change. It contains more than 3 times the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and 4 times the amount stored in all living plants and animals. How much carbon soils can absorb and how long they can store it varies by location and depends on how the land is managed. It's predicted that soils have lost 50% carbon they once held, and that this has contributed to man-made global greenhouse gas emissions that are warming the planet. To help improve soil health, a key factor in the ability of soil to store carbon, we are working with farmers and partners not only in South Africa but across the world and across Africa to equip them with the tools, skills, and knowledge they need. From 2013 till 2020, we trained 4.2 million people. Our trainings cover health and safety and agronomic best practices. We work with farms of all sizes, including smallholders who make up more than 60% of sub-Saharan Africa. Across Africa, we have empowered over 3.6 million smallholders, including through improved agronomic practices that help protect the health and soil. As a result, these 3.6 million smallholders have increased their yields by 50%. Climate change is also very much our new good growth plan. I'd like to finish off by telling you what we're particularly proud of, a tool we introduced in South Africa called Agri-Climb, through which we are helping de-risk climate change for farmers by providing insurance against adverse weather conditions during the growing season and offering possible cashback on products if climate change means they are unable to use them. The tool enables weather conditions to be monitored as well. We are helping transform agriculture to be more sustainable, to produce more, to improve practices, and to deliver inclusive growth. As you can see, through Agri-Climb, we are also doing this by making the most of the potential that the fourth industrial revolution has to offer. In the fourth industrial revolution, we are seeing the boundaries between the physical, digital, and biological worlds are being blurred. We need to be thinking about how we can use this current industrial revolution to address some of the key challenges like global food insecurity and climate change. And that is exactly what Syngenta is busy doing. Thank you very much, Adrianus.
Thank you, Mr. Delbo, for that. And those are certainly issues that we're going to come back later, like regulatory harmonization in Africa, intra-Africa trade, EU-Africa trade, but also global standards and sustainability. Thank you very much. Next, we'll be hearing from Mr. Wandile Siluabo, the Chief Economist of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. Wandile was appointed as a member of President Ramaphosa's Presidential Economic Advisory Council in 2019, after serving on the Presidential Expert Advisory Council on Land Reform and Agriculture between 2018 and 2019. He's also a member of the Council of Statistics of South Africa and a commissioner at the International Trade Commission of South Africa. He's also a member of the Agricultural Economics Association of South Africa. He's a columnist for the Business Day and Farmers Weekly magazine, and is the author of the book Finding Common Ground, Land, Equity, and Agriculture. Mr. Siluabo, how can we improve trade and food markets in Africa and between African economies? And what role can the African Continental Free Trade Area play in this? Thank you.
Thank you, Adrianus, and good afternoon to their colleagues joining online and to fellow panelists. I think to make remarks, Adrianus, on this particular point, I would like to take a step back before diving on into trade perspective to say, generally agriculture in the African continent continues to play an important role in the macroeconomic perspective of a number of countries. And I think now that we are at a stage where a number of countries are coming up with their economic recovery plans from the slump that has been caused by the pandemic, agriculture has to continue featuring prominently onto that. And obviously featuring on the basis of the economic stuff, but also featuring more in a sense that there is still a great capacity to absorb labor, participate within the agricultural sector or on those bases. But there are a few things that I think that needs to be done before we are able to arrive onto that. Because for a number of years, we've seen that productivity in the African continent's agriculture has been very low. If anything, if you move out South Africa, for example, and you leave the rest of the other countries in the sub-Saharan Africa region, you will see that the yields remain disappointing in a number of important crops. So the question is to say, what is causing that? And what can be done differently now to increase the volumes of which then will be important to go back to the story of trade at which you asked about. And obviously, in the quest to increase the productivity, sustainability becomes part of an important parcel of that. And I think that what we typically talk about a lot when we think about rural economy and Africa's agriculture are typical things where we say, let's deal with infrastructure, roads, ports, electricity, and all of those things for making sure that there is agricultural trade and the borders and the movement of products is efficient. But before we are able to do that, I do think that we have to have a product to actually put out in the market, which is where then I think that the story of productivity and how do we sustainably, but in a more meaningful way, increase the output of agriculture in a number of African countries will be important. Because before we talk about trade, we have to have something to sell. And a number of countries are not. And I do think that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, to your question, Andreas, will only be meaningful if there are good volumes from a number of countries which we can be able to move amongst these countries. And I think that the practical, at least in my perspective, near-term intervention onto that, a story of productivity could come in two ways. The first one is about how do we draw in investments in Africa's agriculture. Investment levels in Africa's agriculture, if you look at the data, have been relatively flat on a number of countries. And in fact, in South Africa, in the recent past decade, we've actually seen a little bit of a flattening out on there. But the question is to say, how do you do that? And I think for a number of countries, we'll need to go back to some of the fundamental things of saying, how do we deal with formalizing at least the land rights broadly in a number of African countries, so that we could begin to see private sector capital getting in, and also just general private firms being able to operate into those spaces, and people investing some of their capital on boosting the agriculture and not remaining at a relatively small scale that we are at now and we've been for a number of times, but to say, how do we improve productivity, both at a small scale farming, but also try to get on a more seriously commercialized space. And I think that's the one end. And another end that I think we need to do in the African continent, in our perspective, is really embracing technology. Because aside from South Africa, if you think about the biotechnological space, a number of countries in the African continent have really been reluctant onto that. And obviously there might be a number of issues on a regulatory spaces depending on a country by country. And perhaps these are some of the things that Professor Kirsten in a call can elaborate on, seeing that this is the area that also she does work on. But I do think that on a biotechnological space in the African continent, we need to be more open. And on the basis of those, for example, if you look at South Africa, let's say, which adopted genetically engineered seeds from 2001 in a number of crops, take maize, for example, a staple. If you look at the maize yields in South Africa, they are almost as high as the average of Brazil, which is somewhere around about 5.6 or so. And stripping South Africa out of the sub-Saharan Africa region, the maize yields in the sub-Saharan region are still below 2 tons. Now, for us to be able to trade, I'm making an example by maize, we have to have in a number of commodities where we can actually increase the yields, productivity on a yield basis. But obviously there's another angle on a productivity because I'm looking at it now on an output perspective. But taking technology will also mean that there is a cost aspect which comes on the input side, which is why I was saying that we need to deal with infrastructure issues, but also land governance, so that there could be capital flowing in, which is backing up all of these things. And I think that at a higher level or more conclusive in doing all of this, the principles of sustainability and caring about climate and environment at which we are operating on will have to underpin all of those efforts. But I do think that the story of raising productivity in the African continent will be important. And if we can do that, then the African Continental Free Trade Agreement can begin, Andreas, to be much more meaningful than what we hope for. Because, for example, right now, if you look at the sub-Saharan Africa region countries, we're still net importers on agriculture, more than $2 billion dollars of continent actually spent bringing on some of the commodities. So there is gap to be filled, but that gap will need us to actually obviously. And already amongst the African countries, there is activity happening. I mean, trade, intra-agricultural trade in the African continent is just north of $24 billion. So there is good activity already happening, but I think that increase in productivity, then obviously we could begin to see much more exciting numbers. And I think that as I head towards closing, if I could just close on with the South Africa story, because on our side in South Africa, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that you are speaking, perhaps also latching on to some of the points that Antonio has spoken about. We are in South Africa in export-orientated agriculture. Numbers, we generally export roughly about 51%. So African Continental Free Trade Agreement on our side obviously is of great benefit. We already participate in the rest of the continent, but obviously about 40% of our exports goes to the African continent. That's 40% of about $10.5 billion or so, or on average a year. But all of that is concentrated within the SADC region. Roughly about 80%, 85% is with the SADC region, with the exception of Nigeria and a few countries up there. Now, with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, we will have greater access to a number of these countries. But it's not only just a South Africa story. We also spend about $6 billion importing agricultural products, which means then some other African countries will also get a greater access on participating in a South African market. So there is a lot of exciting stuff on the horizon in the African continent, but I do think that before we are able to enjoy that story of trade, we really need to think about how do we raise productivity, and in the quest of doing that, make sure that the principles of caring about the environment, climate, and all of the sustainability other themes are maintained. I think that for me, if we can be able to achieve that, then the African Continental Free Trade will be more meaningful, at least from an agricultural perspective. Let me stop there, Andreas. Thank you for the opportunity to give some brief remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Wandile, and that makes perfect sense. There are all these parallel processes that have to take place at the same time for trade and production also to be lifted. And you speaking about South Africa gives me a very smooth transition to our next speaker, who will be speaking about the Kenyan example. And we're very happy to have with us Okisegere Ojipat, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Fresh Produce Consortium of Kenya, which is a leading fresh produce trade association with a focus on domestic, regional, and global markets. He has experience in the management and execution of agricultural value chain development by supporting rural farmers and communities, the private sector, governmental institutions and agencies, development partners, non-governmental organizations, and financial institutions. He's engaged in dialogues on sustainable agriculture, with active participation in streamlining the regulatory framework of the sector, which is something we have already spoken about it, while developing and expanding networks across the globe with both governments and private sector, deliberately supporting national and regional quality infrastructure and risk-based food control systems. He has been involved in addressing technical barriers to trade and sanitary and phytosanitary standards in Kenya, and has attended World Trade Organization meetings. Mr. Ojipat, what are the barriers to trade that exporters currently face? And how can we lift those? How can those barriers be lifted? And also, when it comes to Kenya, what is the impact of EU trade policy on Kenya? And what would you like to see in the EU-Africa strategy? Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I truly appreciate and glad to join this topic on this call, or basically to discuss the issues that affect us in Africa and affect us in the world as far as business is concerned. So when you ask me what are the barriers of the barriers that we're experiencing as exporters in Kenya and in Africa at large. The biggest one that we have currently is the regulatory framework that happens in the world. This regulatory framework, particularly with the EU, the changes that happen more frequent than what we are being involved in are hitting our businesses. We are currently facing regulatory changes that affect particularly the plant protection products. And when we talk about the plant protection products, for us where I sit in Kenya, we are central to the equator. And being in equator, it means that we're experiencing suddenly very warm climatic conditions throughout the year. And one of the things that happens is that the way we love good climatic conditions in terms of the warmth is the same way the pests love our climatic conditions. And that means that when we change the regulatory framework affecting the withdrawal of certain molecules without giving us alternatives, that puts us in an awkward place, because it's also very risky and very dangerous for us. And we're finding a challenge here where the withdrawal seems to be done as a must do, other than providing us with alternatives of what we require. So whereas we want to produce more to even feed ourselves and then export, we cannot be able to do that, because if we withdraw the plant protection products without giving us alternatives, it means we will decline in the production of what we require to feed ourselves and to export. And that means there's a bigger barrier in terms of what we are going to supply in the marketplace. And the world will not get any food. And I want to join my colleagues in saying the world population is growing, and it's growing faster than we think. The arable land that we have is in danger when it comes to the infrastructural development in terms of road network, in terms of real estate, in terms of industrial development. And that means the little available land that we have needs to be utilized in a more productive way. And we need to remain very proactive in what we do. And we need to be sensitive. And therefore, for us, the biggest barrier currently, besides logistics, is the regulatory framework, particularly with our biggest trading partner called the EU. And we like this to be addressed. And I'm looking at the risk assessment and the hazard assessment. And we see notifications of certain molecules being withdrawn without being given an opportunity to discuss and to agree on how we are going to have ways of working together. So we will see a decline in exports if we cannot get produce for ourselves. The other barrier that we're having here is the issues of food safety and the unharmonized regulation and harmonized standards across the board. I would like to see harmonized standards across the board so that we do not have to deal with different standards when it comes to dealing with different markets. I would like to see the world that has standards that are acceptable across the board. That will allow me, with the exporters and the Kenyan growers and the African growers and exporters, to export anywhere in the world as long as they meet a specific standard. But if you have standards for EU, standards for Africa, standards for America, standards for Asia, standards for all over, the question is, how many standards am I going to have? And the cost of compliance becomes expensive. And yet for me, compliance is supposed to be made easier without compromise, but should be affordable. So that is the biggest challenge we have, that for us to be able to export, you are expected, for example, on a basic minimum, I need to have a global gap certificate. I need to have a BRC certificate. I need to have I need to have a social standard. I need to demonstrate to my country that I've met all the legal requirements. And I also have to ensure that compliance is done. I am not saying that we should not comply, but we must be able to agree as a world that once you have a certain standard, we will have what I would call an equivalency that will be acceptable across the board. If I meet the Kenyan standards, why don't we have an equivalence to South Africa, an equivalence to America, an equivalence to Europe, an equivalence to Australia, and be able to have exporters export well? So what do I want to see? What I would like to see lifted is I want to see a more accommodative global space where we all meet on the table as partners. I may be a smaller partner, but I want to see a more agreed position as partners, negotiating on the table, looking at practicality of what we do without having to see us in Africa, particularly as junior partners when it comes to the discussion. We are partners, however small we are, because I proudly can say that Kenya has capacity to produce 12 months of the year, 365 days of the year. But please, can we be treated as equal partners? We're also dealing with smallholders, which we support a lot of livelihood. Poverty eradication will be done, but we cannot do this if we impose ourselves such standards that make our smallholder not be able to develop. The other thing I want to see here is I want to see a world that communicates in a more easy language that can be understood. Let's communicate, because business is about communication. If we cannot be able to communicate on time and communicate in an easy understood language, we cannot be able to communicate that way. Then the world will not be in business. So I want to see a communication that comes on time. As I come close to a winding, what I want to see here is I want to see policies that do not just take care of the market, but take care of the producers. If I am producing to supply, what in it for me as a producer, and how am I involved in those policies? And one thing I want to also see, and this I want to persuade, I hope the EU is on call, or someone, the ambassador or somebody will tell them. I want to see who is giving the NGOs and the activists resources to demonize certain production sites without consulting us. How does someone come and speak for and on our behalf and talk negative about the production in Kenya without involving Kenyans themselves and Africans in this case? Who gives them the audacity and the authority to talk about negativity at any time? Why can't we see people talk positive of what is going on in the world other than concentrating on the negativity? Every time I hear about Kenya, besides everything we have talked about, we are still talking about issues of child labor. For heaven's sake, there is something called training and there's something called child labor. And nobody deliberately on the face of the earth will go out there. And for us to be able to achieve food security and trade, there are certain things that must be done. And I want to persuade the EU in particular to talk to their NGOs and those activists to get to know that enough is enough. Let's have dialogue. And therefore, what I want to see in the strategy between EU and Africa is a more acceptable partnership, where there's no big brother, where we are all partners, where we are all having roles to play. And I want to see the molecules not withdrawn. I don't want to see barriers and sanctions being imposed on partners. I want to see a scenario where we say a win-win situation across the globe. We have all roles to play. We import and we export. So if we are going to put conditions on Kenya to export, are we going to put conditions on you to import into our country? Is that what we want? We want to have a dialogue, a discussion between Africa and see inter-African trade and remove tariffs and trade barriers that are unnecessary. It is easier for me to do business with Europe when it comes to logistics than doing business with certain African countries because of the tariffs. I want to see a level playing ground without hurrying the processes. And sometimes we have these unnecessary conditions that we put on ourselves. We are human beings. If we cannot agree on something, that should not be punished. We should not be given punishment. We should agree and say, can we work? As I finish, brother, I want to say this, that all of us have a role to feed the ever-growing population in the world. Innovation is key. Research is key. But most importantly, that in every decision we make, can we make sound decision and allow science to take the lead than politicians? I want to be told, why do we have to allow politicians to make decisions for and on behalf of science? They are not scientists. When they make decisions, who tells them what to make decisions? When they make pronouncements in the street, we are all forced to follow it without due respect to professionals. Let's allow science to take the lead and tell the politicians to then make rules and regulation that are aligned to science. I submit for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ojipat. And definitely negotiating on equal terms, minimizing regulatory costs, but also instilling regulatory flexibility due to changing and different conditions. Very interesting. We'll be hearing next from Liz Corsten, who is the co-director of the DST-NRF Center of Excellence in Food Security at the University of Pretoria. She's also responsible for the food safety program within the COE and actively interacts with other researchers in various institutes. She's a senior editor for food security from Springer and chair of the International Society for Plant Pathology Task Force on Global Food Security. She has addressed the Parliament of South Africa on food security control and has developed a national framework for the government to develop a national food control authority. She has focused her research mainly on complementary fields, of post-harvest technology and food safety as related to international trade in fresh produce. As a team, her group has been able to develop several innovative technologies to reduce disease and prevent product contamination. She has published more than 200 peer-reviewed papers, chapters of books, and supervised 51 MSc students, 20 PhD students, and 11 postdoctoral students. Professor Corsten, how do you see the future of international agri-food trade standards? And how can they help us produce more sustainably while enabling trade rather than acting as a barrier? So how can those standards make us produce more sustainably without inhibiting trade? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. You know, if I look at standards, I always see people totally confused. And first of all, just let's look at the word agri-food. So we're actually combining two disciplines, agriculture and food production, or food processing rather. That's really two different worlds. So if you walk into a food processing plant, for instance, and you look at practices and so-called standards, you will find a whole different mindset compared to agricultural sectors. And here we're talking about seed trade, you talk about nurseries, you talk about pesticides, you talk about fertilizers, you talk about land, you talk about a total different structure, yet we tend to put it together in one big pot. So I think it's important that when we talk standards and we talk trade, that we understand there's different rules and we need to align these. So we also have different trade rules in terms of sanitary and phytosanitary aspects. So a lot of regulatory rules and standards. Now, the biggest issue is people don't understand. They don't know, and they don't understand the basics. So let's just unpack a few things. Let's just look at trade, and I'm going to start with just a few interesting statements and concepts. The first one is, over the last 20 years, we have seen a 400% increase in shipping vessels. And that means globally we are moving more food around than ever before. Now, every time you see these maps of shipping vessels, and I'm not even talking about planes, I'm thinking containers. I'm thinking of massive structures that needs to be moved around, and you need to monitor it. You need to say, where is your product? Is your product still safe? And once again, keep in mind, agricultural product versus food product. Then, very importantly, you need to understand food systems and the complexity of it. Now, when I say food systems, I want to immediately distinguish between the important elements of animal health, plant health, and we can add human health to it, and that's where food safety really comes in. And in fact, the more recent trend to talk about planetary health, which includes your water and all the concepts, and they're all integrated. So we talk about a circular economy today, and we say that these aspects are linked. So there isn't one shoe that fits all. There cannot be one international standard for all these products because they produce different, they move different, they consume differently. And I will never forget being at one of the global food safety conferences where one of the big retailers said, certified once, accepted everywhere. For the last 20 years, I can assure you it has never happened. And I also appreciate the previous speakers saying we should have a standard that's acceptable to all, but there is no one shoe fits all. So we will always have these voluntary standards on the one side, and we will always have these regulatory standards. And it's about who sets the standards, because he who sets the standards will actually speed up the process or stop the process or slow it down. So yes, we've also heard of the importance of science and the contribution in terms of making these decisions and setting these standards. So on a lot of these standard bodies, you often don't see scientists. Often within the regulatory frameworks within government, and if you look at governance systems, you will not see scientists. Academia is absent. And in a way, if we're going into the future, they will have to engage, and not only more within industry and government, but with the community, with society, and demystify science and plug it into where it matters. Now, I think there's another very important aspect that we should take into consideration. It is the impact of the pandemic. It is future pandemics that we will see, and we will see a different way of trading. It will impact on our standards. We can talk about the SDGs in our inability to address food security, for instance. And very importantly, we need to take into consideration the formal and the informal trade systems. And once again, I think all of us are aware that during the pandemic, how the formal sector had a certain way of still addressing and is still assuring that food was moving around. Yet the informal sector had stresses in their system that we couldn't foresee and we couldn't immediately address. So there was massive hunger. And that brings me to a very important point, because it brings me to a point of the right to food. And that's where the social scientists come in, and the regulatory frameworks need to adapt that. Standards need to understand that we're going to trade in food, we must be careful with not making it too restrictive. And I want to go back to a very important point. People don't understand maximum residue levels. They don't understand a normal crop production system where you do need, for instance, fertilizers and pesticides to produce enough food for trade, for the world population. Those are facts, and they're scientific facts. We can develop a standard for MRLs or food safety management systems. But if your public, your community do not understand it and they're not aware of the complexity of it, we will not go forward. And that on its own is a barrier to trade. And that's, on its own, a barrier to food secure world. So I believe we need a new vision for food trade rules. And I will also never forget one retailer once said, if it's not safe, it is not food. So we need to define what is food fit for purpose. We need to obviously bring in these novel technologies. I think it's very important. We need to consider a world without borders. I know one of the big retailers also once said, this is a borderless world. I can purchase my food, I can produce my food anywhere, and I can move it any way I want. But the rules of the game, I believe, has changed. So I believe people need to understand the food journey. We need to better connect farmers and consumers, and the public and all stakeholders need to understand basic aspects about standards. I'm going to mention one, the SQAM landscape. And I don't know how many people know that standards, quality assurance, accreditation, and metrology are key elements of any healthy trade system. I think it's important that people know, and I want to end with a few important quotes, and the one was from the United Nations, where there was a warning in April this year that as we are dealing with this pandemic, and there will be more, we are on the brink of a hunger pandemic that could lead to multiple famines and biblical apportions. And within months, we need to take actions. And if you look at the World Wildlife Fund, they said we need to transform the food system now. And finally, I want to also just mention the World Economic Global Supply Chain Resilience and some of the very important statements for us going forward. And they said that we will need to increase our infrastructure and technical means, and we need to address transparency and fairness if we really want to address food security and fair trade. And I think it's important that we integrate all of these knowledge packages. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Kosten. I'll definitely keep the certified ones available everywhere. That's quite interesting. It could even be the motto of the session. But I'd like to move on with open up the question session, and I would like to ask Mr. Delport first. And my question has to do with the EU-Africa relationship. The EU and Africa are due to agree on their new areas of partnership in the summit due to take place next year. Agriculture is one of the areas identified for strategic partnership. There's also the achievement of a green transition. So what should the EU and Africa strategy partnership look like? And what would be the things you would like to see taken into consideration? Maybe we could answer those questions in 2 or 3 minutes, so we can take the other panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Adrianos. So I think it's clear, and it goes without saying, the importance in terms of the partnership between the EU and Africa. In terms of the exports, we pronounce about 31% and 29% import. That's something that we would like to even take to the next level. The important bit that Africa that can also feed a big part of the world, and in future that will be the case. We need to already think long term how we're going to manage it and ensure all regulation and processes are in place to be able to supply that food in terms of exports. So that to me is a critical point. So what we would like to see is what I also mentioned, is that we try to standardize certain of the processes and legislation to be able to quicker be able to move produce. The mere fact that we can, with our also being counter season, with our position in the marketplace, we will be able to produce enough and nutritious food, which is something that that many just take for granted. But we have to simplify. If we cannot change some of the tariffs, as I think Prof. Kosten also referred to, certain things, the shoe does not fit everything. So if we cannot do that, I believe we have to then simplify processes to be able to quicker do things and to be able to get access throughout Africa, distributing then produce. As also mentioned in my opening comments, the importance of agriculture is vital in any society. So it's not only about, how do we do it and where do we do it? It's a case of we have to do it to be able to be sustainable, which is critical in this situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Especially where I'm based in Brussels, there's been a lot of buzz around the EU-Africa partnership and what that entails. But I would like to hear maybe briefly the wish list of all our speakers. So how about we move to Mr. Siluobo? What's your wish list? What should that be?
Yeah, I think for me, there isn't really much to add from what Antonio has already alluded to, in a sense that, like I said, speaking from a South Africa perspective, being an export-orientated agricultural sector, so continuation of what we're already having on a movement of goods with the EU is one of the important aspects to us. So I think that the maintenance of that, but obviously for other African countries, when one looks now at this as a continent more broadly, I think what some of the points that came up from OJ pretty much speaks to that.
Thank you. Mr. Ojipat, you mentioned a couple of points: equality, negotiating on equal terms, flexibility, regulatory flexibility. What else? What could that be in that wish list?
Even before I go so far in terms of what else is in that wish list, is, as I said earlier, what I'm looking at here is an open, honest, transparent engagement, which gives us a win-win situation without looking like we need to hurry it to finish. But let's be very open, what we want today and in the future. And as Prof has said, with this pandemic, we're going to have many people go hungry without food. So as we do what we do, we must be considerate that there is food safety, there are standards, there is the negotiation and the regulatory framework, but we have a population to feed. So it's critical for us to be able to be aware that we are not just fixing things that look smooth and good and acceptable to us, but we have a population that ever growing that must be fed. So anything that we do besides trade, we must feed the world. If we can't feed the world, then none of us will be existent. So I want to see a level of open, transparent engagement across the board. And for the African continent, it's time to come out of what I'll call our individual selfish interest and open up the space. So we're able to do business within Africa, which is quite heavy, quite substantive, and also being the continent that the world is going to look into in the near future. It's time for us to engage and really be able to be clear of what we want without looking like we're waiting for someone from outside to come and dictate terms on us. That's my submission for now.
Very clear. Openness within Africa, but also openness from the EU side when it comes to negotiations. Professor Kostan, what's your view? I will ask you to switch on your mic. Sorry about that.
Vale. I'm going to make 5 statements. I think scientists need to come back from La La Land and need to engage more and make a difference on the ground. You know, I think fairy tale research, the days are over. We need to focus on research that make impact. We need to communicate our research, and we need to go into partnerships with industry and government. And I think this is very important. The second is the way we package knowledge. And with it comes awareness and science communication. You know, knowledge is a cell phone away, but there's too much knowledge on this. So we need to understand how to manage the information, and we need to digest the information. And we need to be careful of fake news. We've heard a lot about it, but there's fake information and factual information, I think, is very important. So we need to engage in that. Secondly, we need to demystify not only science, but trade and standards and the complexity of it. People need to understand the food journey. People need to know how complex it is to produce enough food, and how difficult it is to move it around, and how important it is to have safe, healthy food and animals and people. And it's all integrated. But I think the journey starts at home. Each person should at least be able to produce their own vegetables, or at least some herbs. And there's no excuse to say, I don't have land, or I don't have a garden. You've got a windowsill, you've got a roof. You need to think creatively of how in future are we going to produce enough food just for home. And then obviously it's not enough, but it can be adding to your food basket, to your nutritious meal. And I know we've seen studies in Uganda now recently during COVID, where actually during the COVID period, those refugee communities could actually be in a way self-sustainable because they already developed their own food systems in a way. I think we need to focus and bring into focus the indigenous foods. And I think we need to really start shifting the power balances. Demystify things. The whole debate around GMOs. If I just start hearing it, I want to run away. Really, we need to produce enough food, first and foremost. And the whole concept about organic food versus commercial food. We need food, first of all. We need safe food, yes, but we need enough food. And if there's no food, we need to be realistic about MRLs, for instance. We cannot have zero MRL, but we expect food on our plate. And I think that's very important.
Thank you very much. No, we should all definitely understand that food doesn't grow on the supermarket shelves. And I'm very happy to tell you that at home with my wife, we started, we planted herbs this year, trying to do our little bit. So that's our start. We planted basil as a start. My next question will be on food waste. And the United Nations has warned that the progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals of especially zero hunger is now looking unattainable for 2050. And according to the World Food Programme, 135 million people suffer from acute hunger, largely due to man-made conflicts, climate change, and economic downturns. COVID-19, the pandemic, could now double that number. So the situation is quite precarious, putting an additional 130 million people at risk of suffering acute hunger by the end of 2020. That's 135 million plus another 130. That brings the number up to 265 million people in the world that are in need of urgent need of food. Meanwhile, at the same time, food waste continues to be a major issue. It has been estimated that between 1/3 and half of all food produced around the world is lost or wasted. That's 2 billion tons of food. How can we better match the supply and demand sides? And Wandile, I'll start with you. You're an economist. So supply and demand side, how do we match those?
Yeah, I mean, I think on my perspective, obviously a number of people that are studying the issue of food waste will weigh in onto this. But I do think that at a broader level, on an infrastructural side, that's one of the bases at which we will have to get back to. And I hate it because this is a discussion that was happening 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and over, where people say deal with post-harvest losses, and we just keep talking about it. But I would say on that point, for me, it goes back to some of the initial remarks that I've made, where I was saying, how do you begin to get investments in agriculture? And I don't mean only the small handouts that governments do closer to the elections and all of those things, but serious investments whereby you can know that we're looking at agriculture, we're looking at the food industry as an important and a serious industry as you look in other industries of the economy. Not only just, something that you do only for welfare and all of those bases. And I think that's only when we begin to have that infrastructure, we can be able to deal with waste at a post-harvest loss side. But obviously there is waste also that happens at a household level, at a restaurant side, and all of those, there's a number of intervention or causes that can be made onto that. And I do think that on balancing per se, even on your question where you say it's about the demand as the supply thing, because if you're speaking on those bases, then you have to ask yourself, if there are people in Lesotho or somewhere in South Africa that are going on, in our country, let me just use that as an example. We have millions of people in South Africa, over 5 million people that actually go to bed hungry. Yet, I was priding ourselves by saying we're exporting about 51% of what we are able to produce. There, the question is not so much about the scarcity of food or the food is expensive, but there are also some of the things then that are outside of the food waste per se, but rather the question of, do these fellow South Africans have a little bit of an income to be able to purchase that food? Because then that's how you describe the demand, because what we have now is a need, not so much of a demand, because folks don't have money to procure that. So I think this issue is more nuanced, but perhaps some of the colleagues in the call are studying it more closely. But I would say for me, at a larger, broader level, the infrastructure side and also ensuring that the population is actively involved in an economic activity to have some bit of income does address some things at a periphery. Thanks.
Thank you. So yes, it's an income-related issue. Mr. Odzipat, what's the situation in Kenya when it comes to food waste?
Yes, thanks. When I talk about food waste and food loss, it sickens, because just like the previous speaker has spoken, we have pockets of people we have many people who have no food, and yet we are wasting food in this country. And it starts with a culture of how much you serve, even as you serve in a restaurant when you go and have a buffet, where people serve, after all, somebody else is paying the bill. I think it's a matter of fact that we must, one, educate people that you must only eat what you can, serve what you can finish, and go for the second helping. And this should be a discussion even in restaurants. When you walk into a restaurant and you're going to a buffet, let's be able to let people know that you can only serve what you can, but you have a chance of coming for second helping if the first portion was not enough. But as again, my previous speaker has spoken, we need to look at infrastructure. There's an infrastructure investment that requires, because certain growing zones in Kenya may not have sufficient road network to be able to get that produce to the marketplace or to the other part of the country, which is basically a logistical issue. Move this food from point A to point B. But also as our governments invest, I don't know what the priorities are, because the priorities will be to feed those people by getting that food from the production sites to the marketplace, to the camps, to the schools. So there's a whole lot of a discussion that we need to have. What I see is a scenario where we have never been open enough in seeing how to feed our neighbor who has no food, but we are selfish to feed ourselves and care less about the neighbor. But this is critical. We now need to look at, if we have to invest, how do we invest on cold room, how do we invest on infrastructure, and what kind of infrastructure? But lastly, on where I sit is also back to standards, as the Prof talked about, the availability of food, the accessibility to food, and basically in terms of the standards. Let me use an example of the supermarkets. Why must I top and tail the beans for me to sell to them? When I cut off the tops and the tails of French beans, for example, or green beans, I'm already wasting, and yet not that they cannot be edible. Why don't we eat the whole bean? Because it came from the farm. Who do you expect to take care of that loss? That is not unsafe food, that's still safe food. But just because you want to see a portion of beans, you cut off the tops and the tails. So we need to have a discussion with the consumers and also the supermarkets to start educating people that you don't need to top and tail. You can still get it and feed your neighbor without food. So it's a whole lot of conversation that we need to increase. And I think an awareness, global awareness of the importance of food waste and loss needs to be hyped up for us to be able to feed the population. Remember that as we talk, we have millions of people who have no food. The pandemic now that we are dealing with is making things worse. And yet, you and I'm sure if we went back to our houses, we have food stuck in our fridges that we are not even using. What do? We need to hype this subject higher than just this conversation. We need to move this further. And I want to see by the end of this conversation that we have an agenda of a team that takes food waste and loss as a serious conversation and engage all stakeholders relevant to be able to achieve this. I submit for now.
Thank you. So it's a matter of infrastructure, but also compassion and education. Professor Korsten, you're an educator. So how do we go about educating the public when it comes to food loss and food waste, but also when it comes to compassion? Could you please turn on your mic?
I want to talk about conscious capitalism, which is a term my youngest son actually explained to me. And I think we have a next generation that better understand that, the importance of caring. I want to also quote one of our DGs recently said, "Stop feeding the hippo." And he was actually referring to people wasting food. And we're talking about wasting food in terms of the plate. And as we heard our previous speaker, waste and losses starts from the field. It's the lost harvest or the low yield. And then only you talk about post-harvest losses, but then the plate losses. And if you dish up a plate of food like this, you are taking away someone else's food. So I think there needs to be a consciousness of eating enough and leaving some for the others that's not fortunate enough to have food. So it's about sharing your food. But if we talk about food, we lose a lot of food through, of course, standards. Now, I'm going to use quality standards. We have the Agricultural Product Standards Act in South Africa, and it's revised annually, and we discuss the quality of a product that will be exported or that can be sold on the local market. And these standards get set and agreed, once again, not often with scientific merit. So we'll debate the size of an orange, and we will say we'll only export oranges of that size and that color and that taste. But who decides what standard should be used? And what happens to the smaller citrus, for instance? So I remember once speaking to the CEO of Outspan in those days, and I asked him, why don't you export smaller citrus? Who said people don't want smaller citrus? I said, in fact, a child's hand is much smaller than an adult. They can actually hold a small citrus fruit, for instance. We need to change the way we think, and that includes standards. Another very important point where we have a lot of waste and losses, and that's with product recalls or product being out of specs. I'm talking about sell-by date food, for instance. And the public don't understand that. Up to what point can you still consume that product? When is it still fit for human consumption? Because unless we demystify these terminologies, the public will keep on wasting food. And that's why we have such a lot of waste. And it's about the education and awareness and demystifying knowledge.
Thank you. There is a big discussion here in Europe when it comes to exactly that, best before or end date, expiry date, and the European Commission, the executive, will address that next year, but it's definitely something that's been discussed here as well, how misleading that could be, or clear instructions that have to be given to consumers, and this is part of a general discussion on labeling as well. Mr. Delport, what can the industry do? What's your view? What can the industry do, and what have you been doing when it comes to this, reducing food loss and food waste, and how could you help as well?
Very good. So I was thinking when Wandile spoke, and also OJ, that another way of addressing this waste is to introduce people to farming, especially in Africa. I mean, the opportunity is huge. And by doing that, we will bring a different dimension. We will bring them into the economy. And as stated also in my introductory notes initially, is that's the fastest growing area. That's where people will not only produce food for themselves and contribute to the economy, but they will also have a totally different lifestyle in terms of becoming owners of what they create. So that links very well to our Good Growth Plan, which is about accelerate innovation for farmers and nature, strive for carbon neutral agriculture, help people to stay safe, and partnering for impact. So I believe there's a lot of value, and that's what we're driving to your question, Adrianos, is that's what we believe will naturally drive sustainable agriculture in terms of the investment Syngenta puts behind this. $2 billion invested into agricultural breakthroughs, 2 sustainable technology breakthroughs per year. That's a type of targets we put ourselves. Back to your question is, Africa's sustainable growth and green transition is something that we are supporting. And that's through amongst others, the Good Growth Plan, and we've been helping to unlock this potential to produce more, but also more sustainably. In terms of Africa specifically, we need to ensure that any European standards projected to Africa are adapted to an African context. The EU's Green Deal proposes clear reductions in the use of inputs, for example. We must keep in mind that Africa and the inputs in Africa use and yields are not comparable to that of Europe, which is quite important. Even corn, where a number of applications are slightly higher in Africa, the amount used per hectare is still lower. So there's a whole educational process that goes with this in terms of the development of people in the rural areas, if you bring them into agriculture. The average African farm performs at only about 40% of its potential. So you can see what potential there is in just training people, giving them the means to be able to produce sustainably, look after themselves, and then get access to the marketing of their produce. Already in 19, half of the world's population facing food insecurity lived in Africa. Also mentioned earlier, despite the continent containing 60% of the world's arable land. So something is not adding up here. And I think if we as an economy across Africa can put more focus on developing agriculture, introducing people, that goes with training, making sure we have the best solutions to be able to grow the food, protect the crop, then I think we're on the right track. And so, and your back to your question, Adrianos, that's what Syngenta is involved in. That's what's driving our business, specifically in the developing countries.
Great, also educating farmers and the producers. My next question, for my next question, I would like to take this discussion to the global level. But before I do this, I would like to remind our viewers to keep posing questions in the chat box. So my questions has to do with WTO and multilateralism. So following the US presidential elections and with the Biden administration coming in the US, there's been a lot of talk about reforming international multilateral institutions like the WTO. So what kind of reforms do you feel are needed? And I'll start with you, Mr. Odspat. You've participated in WTO negotiations before. So the European level, we understand honest talks, equal partnership, but what should happen at the world level? And we already alluded to it when it comes to global standards that include some flexibility, but specifically, what measures would you like to see? What do you think is the best way forward at the global level?
For me, the best way forward at the global level is to appreciate that we are all partners. In whatever level you are, in whatever level we are, that we are partners. And we bring to the table unique products, unique characteristics, and we bring to the table unique opportunities that are open to each one of us. So if we look at partners and looking at the unique opportunities available, without bringing a dictatorial tone, and by basically sitting in WTO as an observer in a couple of, about 2-3 times, I realized there are groups that seem to be more powerful than the others in terms of the countries. And the small countries then have no voice. And perhaps that's why the EU in most cases carries the day, because they come in as a bloc. And I believe strongly that if we can dialogue and negotiate together with the Biden administration coming in, we should not be looking at changing regulation for the sake of it. But most critically for me is I want to see more capacity building, information trickling down, and changing the mode of operation in terms of how to do it. And for those of you who have been in WTO, in most cases, you sit in that place and it's boring. It looks like you're in a court of law. You're more of unnecessary procedures and bureaucracies that do not allow people a latitude to interact in a more open way. You in a situation where you were locked in, and sometimes you ask yourself, was it worth it to spend 3 days sitting, listening to interpretation and documents? And sometimes the jargons that are being used don't make sense. From a grower's perspective, it doesn't make sense. It is more of an elitist discussion than a practical, applicable approach. So I want to see a demystified situation, a dialogue and negotiation, and a practical way of bringing this down to the grower. Because we have discussion in the WTO after that, so what? I want to see that broken down into 2, 3, up to 4 items, and not to be busy changing things, because they're changing for what? You change what people don't even know. I want to see a more engaging, and most importantly, because I work with smallholders, I want to see how do I bring practical solution to smallholders, ensure that more land is open, that the policies allow us some latitude to open up space in terms of how we can do certain trials and see success stories, than being bogged down in this boring negotiation table that you sometimes wonder, was it worth it to travel to Geneva to have this conversation? So that's what I'm seeing here. And as Prof said, let's be real. I want the discussion on MRLs to be real, practical, very real, down to the other person. But so long as the elitists continue talking to themselves, we will never deal with MRLs issues, because the people who are supposed to be applying, putting this into practice, do not understand the discussion that goes on. So I want to see a more improved position, more resources allocated to agri, and the world went into Maputo, particularly in Africa, and we all had all these declarations we did. In Kenya, for example, we've never gone beyond 3% of investment into agriculture, and yet you and I are busy eating. I mean, what is this in terms of the budgetary allocation goes into agri will be critical. When I see a lot of budgets go into security, I keep telling people, if people are certified and they have food, they have no reason to go and break into other places. So we need to look at budgetary allocation towards agri in a more regulatory level. If we are talking about 10%, why don't we push this, ensure that that money is available down to the grower? But as long as the NGOs, they receive the money, come to Africa, for example, we are given money, you are told USAID, USAID, and all these institutions, but the money ends up in the pockets of expatriates and doesn't trickle down. So I want to see a more changed approach when it comes to those things. I submit for now.
Thank you. Mr. Siluobo, just a question. I mean, I would like to address the same question to you, but twist it a little bit. So your book is titled Finding Common Ground. What needs to be done so African nations can find more common ground so they can increase the leverage at global institutions like the WTO? Very briefly, you may.
We were finding common ground in a book on land reform issues in South Africa, not on global international relation issues. But I think more to your point, I think trade will remain obviously more important for the world economy. So the past few years have shown us that there was a bit of a disruption, particularly from the end of the United States and all its views, at least the administration's views to the WTO. My hope is that with the new administration, we will see some bit of stability. And obviously there's now Ngozi of Nigeria, who might potentially head to the WTO in all of those developments. From agriculture perspective, Africa perspective, I think the issues around the subsidies and the unfair advantage that the European and the American farmers tends to have, it's one of the engagements that I think that the African countries have been trying to elevate and have that discussion, and it's not really finding some fertile ground for quite a while. And I think that the discussion around those levels will pretty much be useful. And perhaps as a closing point to some of the stuff that OJ was mentioning, I do think that Africa hasn't been a sitting lame duck over the past few years. That African Continental Free Trade Agreement does give us a more unanimous voice now when we're gonna go and negotiate with other trading partners as soon as we launch it officially. So it will give us that standing block. And to some of the point that he was also mentioning about the tariffs that we do put amongst ourselves, those you will see them as of start of next year being reduced closer to zero. And the only thing that will block you on movement of the products will again the phytosanitary issues as well as the infrastructure constraints that do remain. And I think that addressing all of those SPS issues wherever you're sitting, but also the issue of subsidies, those are some of the important things. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Corsten, regulating at a national level is difficult enough. Intra-Africa level or EU level, even more difficult, but at the global level, that must be a true challenge. So what do you see? What does the future hold when it comes to multilateralism in that area?
I think it's quite important that we must actually just take it down to just to start with regulating the informal sector as well. And you know, I think a lot of people are saying we should not be regulating the informal sector, but I want to use the term regulating, and we have seen in the formal sector that the sector is actually self-regulating. And I think that's the concept, the self-regulatory system where and the informal sector versus the formal sector has systems that's talking to each other. If you take Global Gap and you want to sell to a big retailer, you as a big farmer do have to comply with that, for instance, as an example. Yet a smaller guy might not necessarily comply with that. And particularly at the international level, I have often seen South African lychees being exported with our farms complying with Global Gap. Yet if the season is there or the South African fruit's not on that market, any other country's product will be used, even if those farmers are not certified to, in this case, the Global Gap standard. So we do have these discrepancies. So we should think of a self-regulatory or a regulatory system to control the quality of our food that will be fit for purpose for both the informal, the formal sector, the provincial level, the national level, the regional level, and the global context. So how do we integrate those, that there's fairness in that system? How do you have a food safety standard that says zero salmonella, yet you have salmonella in your water that you use in your irrigation? So there needs to be some rationale behind the way we set these standards or these self-regulatory systems or voluntary standards. We need to go and rethink that. And a nice example is the United Nations World Health Organization project for Codex. And the term they are bringing in now is fit for purpose. The water shall be fit for purpose for your specific production region. And I think that's a very important point because we have different scenarios and different production systems.
Right, thank you. Mr. Delport, my next question is for you. One of the big issues, especially now during the COVID-19 pandemic, has been food resilience and how we minimize the vulnerabilities that exist in our food systems. So what can we do about that? How can we make our food more resilient and our supply chain more resilient?
I think the effect of COVID had some, if we can call it, a positive message across the agricultural segment, which I think is very supportive of agriculture in terms of our whole livelihoods dependent on the agricultural part. And the contribution of agriculture to GDP, as also mentioned earlier, is very important in terms of jobs, etc. So the agricultural story was well told over the last 8 to 10 months. And therefore, we will have to keep on. And now that we have traction, we will have to accelerate this message, especially with government, and then from government also get their buy-in in terms of this whole process of expanding in agriculture. So there are many opportunities, the one of which I mentioned in terms of smallholder farming in South Africa as well, which is on the increase, which is good news. But we will have to be geared for that, to be able to do the training and the introduction into the economy to ensure that we keep on producing safe and nutritious food. So in terms of the way forward, I think within the industry, obviously no company can be everything to everyone. And in South Africa, it was very much a case of, you think it's a competitive advantage to do one thing that you discovered by yourself and try to take over a big market share in the market. So I don't think that's the way Syngenta operates. We put a lot of value on impactful partnerships. So partnerships in general, not only with government, but also with the industry, with players in the industry, becomes very important. So to quicker bring more technology into the value chain in terms of food production, processing, what we do with the waste, and how we're going to keep it sustainable. So I believe that's a very important thing we're very much involved in. But it's also only as good as what you measure. So many of these initiatives that we tend to introduce in the past was not measurable. It's nice to talk about it and impress people with presentations on how far we will have to measure what we plan to implement and then celebrate if we achieve that, so to get more people involved in the process.
Right, thank you. And you mentioned earlier the good growth plan that you have in place. I would like to twist that question a bit and ask you, Mr. Silobo, we see an increased urbanization around the world, people moving from rural areas to urban areas, and that's especially true for Africa. Africa is the fastest urbanizing continent in the world. So what can we do, and what can governments do, especially to support the rural areas in order for those, in their turn, support food production for a growing population? So how do we help? How do we help the smallholders? How do we help the farmers? What can we do?
Yeah. No, I mean, you're 100% correct on the urbanization. In South Africa right now, more than 2/3 of people are already in the urban areas. But I do think that, Andreas, you need to have a certain part of appreciation when you're dealing with African governments, that most of them are broke. The Republic of South Africa, for example, is in a fiscal crisis as we speak. So the idea that what can the governments do to assist farmers is on its own. Yes, they do say that they will assist agriculture, they will do 1, 2, 3, but the reality is that they don't have fiscal space to do that, which is why it was going back to my point where I was saying part of the thinking is about saying, how do we stimulate investments in the agricultural sector? What are some of the prerequisites that we need to see in the rural economy so that private sector players can dive in, and obviously some partnering with some locals that are there, so that we can begin to see stimulating activity, of which then the governments can, over the long run, begin to accumulate through tax revenue and have money to spend in some of the social spaces. So we can't really begin to put this onto them. I think the question is, how do we stimulate investments in Africa's agricultural space? And I think for me, I still submit that the point that I made earlier to say improve the land governance, formalizing land rights and all of those things doesn't really need fiscal space, but rather it needs certain movements on the legislative space. And that on its own begins to send the right signal so that where infrastructure exists, those pieces of land begins to be attractive. Then you will see people partnering with locals and some economic activity begin to take place. And output of that is the one that ensures that the market, those folks that are in the urban areas, they begin to enjoy high quality products, which will be coming from the countryside. And I do think that there really needs to be that, where African governments don't think that they will always do, but they should think about how do they do to make that environment more open to investments.
Thank you. And Mr. Ojipat, sort of the same question. So what's the situation in Kenya, and what can be done to keep rural farmers in rural areas instead of an influx to the cities?
Number one is that I must bring to information that in Kenya, more than 85% of the growers are smallholder. And the threat is right. If we do not address it, we are going to be food insecure in the next few days, and we have to rely on imports. And we don't know where we are going to import from, because every country somehow is facing the same challenge. So for me, one is about partnerships, and two, that our governments need to set regulation on land use and be able to really address this in a candid manner. Because in an African culture, the land use, particularly like in Kenya, the policies are completely upside down. I don't see setups like I've seen in parts of the world where agricultural land remains protected. This is a threat. So, but we need to give innovation. We must motivate people to get to the farms. If the smallholders or the Kenyans who are in urban areas can go to the rural area and start growing, what is the motivation? Are we going to buy their products? Are we going to ensure that they get access to the market? Is the business going to be profitable to allow them to be professional farmers and be in the farming community? If we do not do that, the urban migration, rural-urban migration will remain a fact, because although it's not as decent as it is when you go to town, but at least there is an assurance that somebody will give you some work in an industrial park or something, which is not sometimes healthy. And I believe strongly if we can stimulate the discussion on how we even work on our tax regimes in terms of encouraging and supporting the smallholders in the rural area, that will be able to lead many investors towards the rural area, and they will be able to produce more, first for themselves, as I said earlier, and then ensure that there's trade. And for me, as long as people can be able to be assured of the next meal, they are able to start thinking straight and looking at others. But as long as people are still struggling, looking for the next meal, because many people are not even assured of the next meal, then the crisis will remain, and even having that sober conversation remains a challenge. So governments and ourselves, the partnerships, and seeing how the private sector can play the role. And I keep saying, the governments must do the business of facilitating private sector to do business. The governments have no business in doing business. So that for me remains a fact. The governments have no business of doing business, but have a business of ensuring that they put the proper framework that stimulates its private sector to do business, particularly in agri. I submit.
Thank you very much. Professor Corsten, I would like to ask you a question when it comes to trade facilitation, meaning simplifying, modernizing, and harmonizing the exports and imports. We talked before, we talked about the measures such as labeling, but what kind of trade facilitation measures do you think that can be brought into Africa, but also internationally, in order to unlock the potential of our markets?
Yes, I think that if you just look at labeling, and I'm going to use an interesting concept, and that was a study we recently did in terms of the pesticide industry, looking at the whole regulation of that, and specifically looking at labeling. So the legislation around labeling is quite interesting because in the case of Swaziland, for instance, there was a lot of products coming into the country, and the chemicals were not necessarily understandable or user-friendly because of the labeling, and it was in Mandarin. So there was a restrictive factor for the farmers in terms of adopting that technology, the labeling technology around, say, for instance, how to use the pesticide or when to apply it. We've also done a study in SADC to just look at availability of pesticides for farmers, and also, and I'm talking small farmers now, and particularly farmers in rural areas, and also getting access to smaller quantities of the product, for instance, and having the knowledge in terms of how to use it and when to use it. Now, I want to say one must acknowledge what a lot of the big companies, chemical companies, are doing. And in this case, there's a lot of knowledge being shared and distributed. In fact, in this one study, there was a lot of support given, and it was by one of the big chemical companies who provided, for instance, masks and knowledge. But there's not enough of that happening. We need to make sure that everybody can understand how to use that product. And once again, if you have a labeling problem, you can't read the label, you can actually translate it, or you can link with the company and get that information, because there is connectivity now. And I think that's an important point that we should develop, and we should appreciate how difficult it is. I've also had a similar study that was done in Brazil, for instance. So if we want to open up trade and share chemical products, for instance, or biological control products, we must make sure that the labeling is such that it is user-friendly and understandable and easier to use. And I think that's the biggest challenge. And that's where I think a lot of innovation can happen. And a lot of things can be done to make it accessible. I want to use another example, and that's hand disinfectants. We've also recently done a study just to look at the labeling of what is in the disinfectants or the sanitizers, hand sanitizers. And more than 50% of the products were inadequately describing either the active ingredient, the content, or the storage of the product, or the even expiry date. So there's a lot that can be done to empower the consumer or the farmer to more effectively use products.
Thank you very much. Another question that came through the chat is how can we compete on international markets when American and other companies, Europeans as well, are heavily subsidized by the governments? So how do we deal with that? Mr. Silobo, you want to take it that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it dives in part to the points that I was mentioning about the WTO conversation. But at the end of the day, I mean, that's not the stopping of all of the process. Like I was saying, as the Republic of South Africa, we are deep in the markets. We're doing roughly 10.5 billion rands on an annual basis on export revenue. So that doesn't really prevent you to actually get in, but obviously it could be a fair playing field if you didn't have to have that unfair environment. But a number of countries do already obviously use other trade instruments on countering those subsidies. Either they're using import tariffs or whatever trade instruments that they do have on their end, which then means that individual country regulators will have also to be a bit more awake as they deal with some of these trading instruments. But not to say they should be abusing the tariffs per se, but there is a fair way of using and countering some distortions that do get introduced by some either European products or the US or wherever where subsidies do exist. But the key question or the key point of being able to compete with the Brazilian farmer is being able to be competitive. And for that, you have to have access to that technology that the Brazilian farmer is also having. And that goes back again, Professor Kirsten and OJ were speaking on those regulatory points, and to a certain extent, Tony also spoken to those. Then we need to make sure that access to inputs and all of those things are at least available so that I can be able to produce just like my counterpart in Monte Grasso, Brazil, and be able to deliver the products. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Delport, we have a question from Sabrina, a journalist, asking if producing more sustainably, more sustainably is really possible. Can we produce more sustainably? And can we produce more while also taking care of our soil, water, and biodiversity?
That's a relevant question, and the short answer is yes, absolutely. A lot which we also touched on goes with training in terms of making sure people know how to do it. So it's not only about knowing what we have to do, it's also very much now about how we're going to do it and how should it be done to ensure sustainability. So if you look at Africa, currently, on average, in general, 40% of the potential is currently yield in terms of what they plant, which is far below the average what can be done. So there are numerous things that can, through training, be corrected. If we carry on with this trend as it is now, only 40% of the potential, by 2050, we'll only produce 13% of what we need. So we will have to look at certain areas where the potential has not yet been totally exploited, explored, and it has to be done in a sustainable way. So I have no doubt in terms of the available technology, whether it's protecting the crop, protecting the seed, and then also in terms of genetics, and then mainly on the practices side, exactly how to do it. No question about that. We can increase it significantly. We can double it basically in a few years by and still looking after the soil, still making sure we put back what we take out in terms of crop production. So no question about that one.
Thank you very much. As we're going close to the end of our discussion, I would like each one of you for a minute to tell me what the main takeaway is. What would you like our viewers to take away from this discussion? If there's one thing that you would like them to take away from this discussion, what would that be? And Professor Corsten, I'll start with you.
I want to say farming is fun. And we should all start producing our own food, and we should share our food, and we should make sure that that food that we serve to our family and friends and in our community is safe, nutritious. So it's all about informed decisions.
Thank you. Farming is fun. Mr. Odzipat, what's your take? What's the one thing that we should take away from today's discussion?
Life is real. And therefore we must be practical in whatever we do. But it's not just about our viewers and listeners. I want to challenge ourselves. And the challenge here is, after this discussion, so what? Are we going to have another discussion, another discussion? As we wind up, I want to challenge Syngenta, even as we thank them for organizing this. One thing I want to ask is, can we partner and start small, practical takeaways, one or two things that we can do and say, if it's education, can we partner in educating a village and use it as a model? I'm available and ready to start there. But as long as we end up in these discussions, it becomes difficult. I want to see practical solutions. I want to see practical evidences, and I want to walk one step at a time towards a direction, because I'm tired of discussions in boardrooms. I'm a farmer, and the best place to do this is in the field. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Silogo, in the field, what's the takeaway?
Two things for me. I think I would like to see the African governments being more open to biotechnology. That's one. Second and last point, I would like to see serious improvement on land governance, embracing giving individual land rights where possible as a means of beginning to attract investments into agriculture, so that we can finally see commercialization of all of these smallholder farmers that are spread across the continent. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Delport.
So for me, it is farming is not a luxury, it's a necessity. And it's about how we're going to do it in a sustainable manner. And there are ways of which technology and knowledge play a very important role.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting discussion. There were many points raised. I will start by saying that negotiations with the EU from an African perspective, but also the global level, to take place on an equal footing, on equal terms. Also, there's a lot to be discussed about the regulatory costs and how we minimize those, both at the national level, at the EU-Africa level, but also at the global level. How do we go about educating consumers, but also educating farmers? And I will also add educating policymakers, which is an important point to make, while highlighting the very specific aspects of African farming. So one size doesn't fit all and doesn't certainly fit African farming. And I would like to conclude by thanking all our speakers, but also all our participants for tuning in, and also Syngenta for making this possible. And as a last thought, maybe I would just say that it is very important to start, as Mr. Ozubak said, at the smallholders level, at the local level, with very practical steps. And all of us, and that includes the policymakers, the industry, the educators, the specialists, but also media, can help in that. We should all help in that, and we all have a role to play. Thank you very much for tuning in. The discussion doesn't end here, but I look very much forward to catching up with all of you again in the future, to take the main takeaways of today's discussion forward. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for tuning in. Have a good day all.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. That was a great panel discussion about sustainable food markets and trade, facilitated by Mr. Andrianos Giano, who's the Public Affairs Manager at Euractiv. And he tuned in all the way from Brussels. So thank you very much. And we do appreciate all the other panel members who contributed great points to what could create sustainable food markets and trade as well, particularly in the sector. Interesting ending and conclusive point there by a representative of Syngenta, saying farming is not a luxury, it is a necessity. And I don't see what other way would be great to truly conclude that panel discussion, particularly around sustainable farming. We have reached the end of our 3-day program. It has been jam-packed. It's been quite challenging. And I did promise you on the first day that we can't have discussions around shallow waters. We're going deep, and indeed, we truly went deep and deeper, and we hit the core of the ocean. So thank you so much to all of our speakers that contributed in discussions, in asking questions, and in their participation as well. We also wish to thank all partners and sponsors, Old Mutual, Syngenta, Tetra Pak, and all other partnering organizations that ensured that Cape Media achieved this successful summit. Truly, it is successful, not even in my opinion, but based on the evidence that we have noted. And please kindly note on your side that all discussions will be available online. And as viewers, we've got registered records of your emails and your details. So links will be emailed, particularly the presentations that will be shared by our speakers as well. So please do look out for those emails regarding the links and also the presentations, if at all there were any presentations that were shared. And those that visited the exhibition, thank you very much. We will be announcing, in fact, winners will be called. They will not be announced because everything needs to be checked out and tallied accordingly. And once again, thank you very much for your participation, to all the mayors, ministers, political officials, companies, partners, etc., that have logged in and truly also invited their employees to log in and really derive some value from the Sustainability Summit. Thank you very, very much. We do appreciate the contributions, and we do appreciate your time as well. We are signing out. It's been a privilege and an honor to have all of you log in onto this platform. And let us remember the great words from Mahatma Gandhi, who said, "What we are doing to the forests of the world is but a mirror reflection of what we are doing to ourselves and to one another." And those are great sentiments to start taking ownership of sustainability, not just rely on government or particular entities for implementation, but it really does start at home, in our own sectors, in our own spaces, making sure that the little changes we make can truly go a long way. And I even believe when Stephen Udall would say, plans to protect air and water, as well as wilderness and wildlife, are in fact plans to protect man. So when we take care of nature, the earth, and everything else that is around us, we truly and deeply take care of ourselves. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been an honor. Please do continue to add your comments in the last few minutes on the SAS Summit 2020. We look forward to engaging further, and thank you all for your contribution and your participation. I also wish to extend gratitude to Cape Media for seeing fit that we need to have these conversations, and also the team that made sure that they put everything together, technical team that designs and so forth. Having a virtual summit is not easy, but we thank guys like Brent who sit behind those computers and make sure that we look good in front of you. So thank you very much for your participation, and we look forward to engaging further and seeing you soon on other platforms offered by Cape Media. Take care, keep safe, and stay healthy.